Imagine a world where almost everything was shared. For the vast majority of our 300,000-year history as Homo sapiens, that was the reality. Our ancestors lived in small, nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers, their lives defined by mobility and mutual dependence. In such groups, the concept of owning land was as foreign as owning the air. Tools, food, and shelter were communal assets, crucial for survival in a harsh and unpredictable environment. The most valuable property was not an object, but social capital, one's reputation, skills, and relationships within the group. This egalitarianism wasn't necessarily a moral choice. It was a practical necessity. Storing surplus food was nearly impossible, and hoarding resources would have been counterproductive, even dangerous, potentially leading to ostracization or conflict. The social norms of these societies, often enforced through rituals, gossip, and sharing mechanisms, actively work to prevent any individual from accumulating too much power or wealth. This was the foundational human condition, a state of relative economic equality that persisted for millennia. The seismic shift away from this model represents one of the most profound revolutions in human history, a transition that would lay the groundwork for everything from ancient empires to modern capital markets. It was a revolution born not of a single invention, but of a slow, intertwining dance between a new way of life, agriculture, and the human impulses for security, status, and legacy. This shift from a world of us to a world of mine and theirs fundamentally rewired our social structures, creating hierarchies that have defined civilizations ever since. The catalyst for this great transformation was the Neolithic Revolution, the momentous shift from foraging to farming that began independently in various parts of the world, roughly 12,000 years ago. When humans began to deliberately plant seeds, domesticate animals, and settle in permanent villages, they were unknowingly sowing the seeds of private property and social class. Agriculture created a fundamentally new relationship between people and the land. Land was no longer just a territory to be traversed, it became a specific, improvable, and transferable asset. The labor invested in clearing fields, building irrigation ditches, and maintaining soil fertility created a powerful, intuitive claim to that piece of earth. This was the genesis of the idea of landed property. For the first time, it made logical sense to think, this field is mine because my family and I worked to make it productive. This connection between labor and asset ownership is a cornerstone of property rights that echoes through to the present day. Simultaneously, the ability to produce a reliable surplus was the key that unlocked the door to inequality. For a hunter-gatherer band, a large kill like a mammoth was a windfall, but it was perishable and had to be consumed quickly. A granary full of wheat or barley, however, was a storable, durable form of wealth. This surplus could be saved for a lean season, used in trade, or, crucially, concentrated in the hands of a few. With the advent of surplus and settled life, the very nature of things began to change. While early agricultural societies may have held land communally, certain types of property became inherently personal. The first unequivocal forms of private property were likely portable and intimately tied to individual identity and skill, finely crafted tools, weapons, jewelry made from shells or bones, and eventually, the domesticated animals that lived with the family. A bull or a flock of sheep was a living, breathing, reproducing form of capital. Unlike a hunted animal, livestock could be owned, inherited, and accumulated. This accumulation was the engine of the first wealth disparities. Families or individuals who, through luck, skill, or greater labor, managed to build larger herds or produce larger harvests, began to amass economic power. This economic power soon translated into social influence. In a village, the person who controlled the surplus grain could provide for others during a famine, could sponsor feasts to gain prestige, and could afford to support specialized craftspeople. This created networks of obligation and debt, the invisible threads that begin to bind a society into hierarchies. The stage was now set for a social structure that was no longer flat, but pyramidal, with a growing distance between those who had much and those who had little. The transition from generalized wealth differences to rigid, institutionalized social stratification was not an overnight event, but a gradual process that unfolded over centuries. As successful families consolidated their wealth over generations, their economic advantage became entrenched. the concept of inheritance became a powerful mechanism for solidifying inequality. A son didn't just inherit his father's fields and animals, he inherited his father's social standing, his network of alliances, and the obligations others owed him. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where wealth begat more wealth and status became increasingly hereditary. To protect their accumulated assets, these emerging elites had to develop new social and political structures. Informal leadership, based on prestige and persuasion, began to evolve into formalized authority. The most successful heads of families or clans likely formed councils of elders, who began to make decisions not just for their kin, but for the entire community. Their role expanded to include the management of communal resources, the resolution of disputes, and most importantly, the organization of defense. As settlements grew and resources became more valuable, conflict between communities increased, necessitating organized warfare and dedicated warriors. This further centralized power in the hands of those who could command and equip fighting forces, adding a new coercive layer to their authority beyond mere social influence. This nascent elite did not merely rely on force or economic power. They mastered the art of ideology to legitimize and perpetuate their privileged position. Religion and ritual became powerful tools for sanctifying the new social order. In early agricultural societies, the elites often positioned themselves as intermediaries between the common people and the gods. They controlled the calendars for planting and harvest, presided over crucial rituals to ensure fertility, and oversaw the construction of monumental religious structures. Think of the massive stone circles, like Stonehenge, or the early temples in Mesopotamia. These projects required the mobilization of vast labor forces, a clear demonstration of the elite's power to command and organize. By linking their rule to divine will, they made social stratification seem not like a human invention, but a natural and sacred part of the cosmic order. It was no longer just that one family was richer, it was that the gods had destined them to lead. This ideological shift was crucial for maintaining stability in increasingly complex and unequal societies. It provided a moral and spiritual justification for why some people worked the fields, while others directed their labor, why some lived in simple huts, while others resided in larger compounds. This fusion of economic, political, and religious authority created a ruling class whose power was multifaceted and deeply embedded in the culture itself. The theoretical framework of this transition is powerfully illustrated by the archaeological record, and few places offer a clearer window into this process than the ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. For over 1,000 years, from around 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, Çatalhöyük thrived as a large, densely packed Neolithic town without any obvious signs of stark social hierarchy. The houses were remarkably uniform in size and design, and burials reveal a relatively egalitarian distribution of grave goods. There is no evidence of a chieftain's house or royal tombs. This suggests a society where status was likely achieved through personal prowess or ritual knowledge rather than inherited wealth. However, even here, we see the seeds of change. Some houses contain more elaborate wall paintings, ritual installations like Bucrania bull skulls, and slightly higher quality obsidian tools. This hints at the emergence of history houses, structures that may have served as ritual centers for specific lineages, allowing them to accumulate intangible social and symbolic capital over generations. Çatalhöyük represents a critical middle ground, a complex society on the very cusp of stratification, where the mechanisms of inequality were beginning to stir but had not yet hardened into a rigid class system. It shows us that the path to hierarchy was not a single event, but a slow cultural drift. As we move forward in time and westward in geography, we encounter the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, which provide a stunning contrast and show the full flowering of social stratification. By the 2nd millennium BCE, these were palatial societies, with power and wealth concentrated in the hands of a king and a small bureaucratic elite centered around immense palace complexes like Knossos and Pylos. The Linear B tablets, the administrative records of the Mycenaeans, paint a detailed picture of a highly centralized, top-down economy. The palace controlled vast agricultural lands, herds of livestock, and the production of key commodities like bronze and textiles. It collected taxes in kind, redistributed goods, and organized specialized labor on a massive scale. Society was clearly divided into classes, the Wanax king at the apex, followed by a hierarchy of military and religious officials, then a class of landowners and local officials, and at the base, a vast majority of farmers, herdsmen, and slaves. Private property existed for the elite. The king and his nobles held estates, but for the common person, their relationship to property was largely mediated through obligations to the palace. This was inequality codified and managed by a state apparatus. The culmination of these millennia-long processes was the birth of the state as a formal entity, an institution whose primary function, from an economic perspective, was to protect the property rights of the ruling class and manage the inequalities it had created. The first states in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China did not emerge to create equality, but to administer complexity and enforce order. They developed written laws, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, which explicitly codified different rights and punishments for the elite, commoners, and slaves. These legal systems institutionalized the social divisions that had been brewing for ages. The state's monopoly on violence was used to put down internal dissent and protect private holdings from external threats. It built infrastructure like roads and granaries to facilitate the movement of tax goods and armies. In this new order, social stratification was no longer an accident of fortune. It was the fundamental organizing principle of civilization. The pyramid was complete, a broad base of food producers supporting a small apex of rulers, priests, warriors, and administrators who directed the economic, spiritual, and political life of society. This deep historical journey reveals a challenging truth. The economic foundations of our modern world, private property, class, and the state, are inextricably linked to the origins of social inequality. The same forces that gave us the stability to build cities, develop writing, and create art also forged the chains of social hierarchy and systemic exploitation. The transition from communal sharing to private ownership was a Faustian bargain of sorts, trading the rough-hewn egalitarianism of our hunter-gatherer past for the dazzling but deeply unequal complexities of civilization. Understanding this cradle of inequality is not about passing moral judgment on the past, but about comprehending the deep-seated structures that continue to shape the distribution of wealth, power, and opportunity in our own world today. The echoes of the Neolithic Revolution are still with us, resonating in every boardroom, every legislative chamber, and every conversation about economic justice. Thank you for watching this in-depth exploration of one of history's most pivotal transitions. If you found this lecture insightful, please support the channel by subscribing and giving this video a like. It helps us continue creating detailed content on the forces that shaped our world. In our next lecture, we will delve into the technologies that powered these early societies. We will explore the revolutionary impact of craft and first technologies, pottery, weaving, and metallurgy, and see how human ingenuity in shaping clay, thread, and metal further transformed our economic and social landscape.